Hey guys, welcome to episode 4 of the Sports Business Leaders Podcast. SBL is a community event series, and now a podcast that features innovators, disruptors, and people really making a difference in the sports ecosystems. Sports ecosystem. I'm your co-host Jake Voorhees. With us, we have Justin Tichenel.
What's going on, Jake? Appreciate you having us.
Absolutely. And today we have a thought leader in the NIL space, Jake Kovalcik from Top Star Athletic Club, who's really trying to do something different in the NIL space, which is booming right now. I think you have a lot of companies who are doing a version of the same thing. And also, just like our last episode, we have some interesting ways to position your vision, your company. And I think we have some lessons from Jake about pivoting and being nimble to that approach. Jake, how are you doing today? Welcome to the
I'm
show.
doing great, guys. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. And a thought leader, that's a big it's a big name.
It's one of those words you hear in science and
Love
this
it.
and
It's one
that
of my
that's
favorites. It's one of my favorites.
trickled into the business world. So why don't you just get started and let us know? I mean, NIL is still this space where unless you're really in it for the last 3 years when the
Yeah.
policy change happened, I think everybody's still trying to figure it out
Yeah.
and learn from it. So yeah, why don't you bring us back to the early days? How did you get to here? And then we can get into some lessons and
Yeah.
pivot notes.
So I was a lacrosse player. You can tell I got my sticks back there, from Gettysburg, and sort of the genesis of Top Star version 1, which is really what this is, a journey from Top Star to, how it started to where it is now, was to really help, our tagline is to make NIL work better. And what we were trying to do was help those kids that were like me, like, Justin, like you, Jake, like guys that aren't playing massive, revenue generating sports, take advantage of NIL. So we really took a look at the market, and as I started digging in, I was kind of shocked that nothing like that existed. There were platforms out there like Mogul and Influencer and Open Doors and even NoCap that had a bunch of student athletes that were aggregated together. But as a guy that worked for a big brand, Anheuser-Busch, I was like, I needed to, as a media buyer, as somebody who was trying to buy things at scale in a region, I needed really to understand, like, okay, how is this going to, how can I ensure delivery? How do I make this easier for myself? So really what I did was I set out to make a product, quite frankly, that addressed a need that when I was working for Anheuser-Busch, I would have had. And then, of course, to sort of differentiate ourselves and really kind of make this this interesting thing that I thought would make it more brand friendly and more brand safe, we took a really hard look at balancing academics and athletics. So we had GPA requirements. We only worked with a specific number of schools. Like we worked with top 50 large national universities and private and liberal arts colleges. And we put everybody together in this team. So, we had digital standards, we had social media standards, like you had to represent yourself and your school with good character. And again, we focused on kids that were playing non-revenue generating sports. So these were kids that, we started out in lacrosse because we're lacrosse players, but all these kids, they were never going to get an NIL deal in and of themselves. They just didn't have enough followers. They're all great kids, super smart, going to Ivy League schools like Notre Dame, UNC, Lehigh, Cal Berkeley, all these awesome schools. But, 2,500, 3,000 followers, that doesn't even register on a brand's radar, even as a micro influencer. So our goal was to aggregate all these kids, put them into this team, basically just group them together, and then amplify, their message across their individual sort of social networks and help them, drive authentic content. So that's what we did. We raised some capital on that. We did 6 brand campaigns from the jump. We did them across every category. So it wasn't just endemics to sports. We would be a beef jerky one. We did a shoe company. We did a nutrition company, sunglasses, an athleisure company. And then we're kind of on the cusp of getting our first really big campaign going. And as we were building out that campaign, we were sort of at the same time, and this is probably this past March, I guess. Yeah, March, April of this past year, because we wanted to really understand from an athletic director, from a coach's standpoint, what are you guys seeing in NIL? What types of kids, what kind of campaigns, how do we get smarter about what we're doing so that we can drive, not just more value to the brands, which, we kind of figured that out with the standards and process, but how do we make sure that we're driving more value to the student athletes, so that to everybody in the entire ecosystem, right? If you're not driving value to every sort of step in the process, something's going to fall off. So we're just trying to make sure we're driving value everywhere. And as we're having these conversations with the coaches and the ADs and just sort of people in administration, like across the board, we're realizing that we're hearing the same thing over and over and over again. And this is where the pivot started, right? So we realized that, okay, this, and also watching the way that the NCAA is doing things, right? Like, the House versus NCAA is one of those things that is a very, very, very slippery slope, right? You've got, it just came out that like schools like Arizona are having people sign, documentation, like student athletes that are coming in they're signing documents to sort of preempt what's going to happen with this rev share that may or may not happen, right? So the entire sort of NIL space is like a little slippery, and that scares people. And where it scares people, like most normal people, like I see opportunity. I'm like, there's this opportunity here, not just for us, but for a lot of people to come in and really kind of set the standard and help sort of kind of, really set the standard of what it can be and what it should be. So that's kind of where things are at. And again, so we were having these conversations and we realized there's a bigger problem. And that bigger problem is athletic departments are bleeding cash. And it's because of NIL pretty directly, right? So 5 years ago, this wasn't a thing. NIL was not a thing. And the athletic departments were just kind of moving on. The transfer portal also plays a big role in this, which we can or don't have to talk about, but it really does, because those two things are unfortunately now kind of intrinsically tied together. Because if you get an NIL deal at one school, nothing is stopping you or another school from giving a kid a bigger NIL deal. That kid hitting the portal and then bouncing out. So what's happening really now is that you've got your top 20 across pretty much every sport has their top 20, but like, let's use, I'll use lacrosse just because kind of that's my thing, right? So you've got the top 20 for lacrosse, and I talk about this a lot. You're going to see a lot more movement, and you're going to see a lot more different movement in the top teams from a recruitment perspective, from a athlete perspective on their teams, because they just don't need to recruit high school kids anymore. And now there is going to be, in like, if you're watching again, like this is such a wildly open-ended conversation. I will tie this all together, I promise. But it's like, now you've got like the quarterback from Vanderbilt is pushing on the JUCO button, and it's like, okay, like do junior college years count towards the NCAA eligibility? If they don't count, like, oh my goodness. So now you've got PG kids, you've got reclasses, you've got JUCO. You legitimately, like, I mean, hockey's been doing this forever, but now in lacrosse, you could legitimately have like a 21-year-old freshman coming in, or a 21-year-old freshman coming in with still 4 years of eligibility. Like, now you're playing grown men. Like, you're not going to pull a 17-year-old into this grown man environment. Like, it's just not going to work. So my point on all that is, with the transfer portal, with the new movement from all these different areas coming in, with D3, D2, club, junior college, all kind of being like, the tryout, if you will, for the big time Division I programs, you're going to see a lot more movement in those Division I programs across the top 20, across every sport. It's coming. It's starting to happen in football and basketball. And Darren Heitner posted an article today about the Rider College, which, where Rider is, right outside of Philly. They have, like, the number of transfers versus freshmen that they've had since 2021 has changed dramatically. And so all the things that I've been saying, without having really any anecdotal data or any data whatsoever, this guy just solidified. He's like, yeah, we have more transfers and more of these coming in than freshmen. I'm like, knew it. So my point is, with all these athletic departments now struggling to recruit athletes, they have a lack of funds, and this lack of funds is like, killing them. So they can't recruit, they can't retain the student athletes that they do recruit, and by losing them, they can't compete. So what we have done is pivot the entire, Top Star company from this student athlete influencer organization that was putting standards and process, which, by the way, worked tremendously well, still part of Top Star, just not our lead sort of product anymore. And now we're building a fundraising product to help drive revenue to athletic departments of all sizes, so they can help, so we can help them recruit, retain, and compete. Now, are we going to solve all of their problems? Absolutely not, because, like, look at the top 10 football schools, right? They all do $200 million a year. And it's like, the head of the SEC is like, we need to find additional revenue lines. Like, if that guy's saying it, everybody needs it. So the point is, like, we address this issue from like the SEC all the way down to Gettysburg, right? Like to the Centennial Conference. And every single one of these schools is going to be facing the same issues where how do we find incremental revenue? What do we leverage to get that incremental revenue so that it's low lift, so that we can recruit, retain, and compete? And that is what we're doing. We have a digital product, we have a mobile and a local product, and then we have our influencer product that we bring in. So we're like really delivering what we believe can be like a completely self-sufficient, fully sustainable NIL ecosystem across the board. Like that's our goal, right? Like our goal is to build this sustainable NIL ecosystem. And instead of like worrying about what the NCAA is doing, because everybody's like, oh my God, what are they doing? Instead of worrying about how individual schools are going to react, we are sort of building upon the utter bedrock of the NCAA, of the college athlete ecosystem, which is brand dollars, right? Like for time from the very first college football game until today, brands want to be associated with sport. They want to be associated with the people associated with sports. And the thing that we know, they aren't donors, right? So you're not going to hit donor fatigue. You're not going to, run into all these weird things where like you're asking people for $50,000 over and over and over again. And finally they're like, they just want to win, and you can't buy wins. And I say this like all the time. It's like, if you could buy wins, the Yankees would win every single World Series and the Dallas Cowboys would win every Super Bowl. And I don't like either of those teams, so I'm glad they don't. But it just doesn't guarantee wins. And that's what the donors want. Brands don't want that. Brand KPIs are completely different. They want impressions. They want, they want click-throughs. They want very different, very measurable things. And they determine success differently than donors. So we're building upon that foundation. That foundation never changes. Yes, the budgets fluctuate year over year, depending on a variety of different factors. But the overall sort of philosophy that tapping into brand dollars to support student athletes and help driving revenue into athletic departments is a much better proposition than trying to go out to the richest donors of XYZ school, continuing to try to drive revenue that way into athletic departments, because eventually it is not sustainable and eventually it is all going to sort of crumble. The end.
Jake, and having come from a similar background, both of us playing at Gettysburg College, different sports.
By the way, Gettysburg, Jake.
So Kovalcik, yeah. So Jake Kovalcik, Gettysburg Jake. Having come from a similar background, it's really interesting to hear your perspective on the NIL, having come from a Division III perspective.
Yeah.
So, and you spoke about a lot of really interesting things. So thanks for sharing that. But I think one of the main things that I really thought about and thought that was very interesting was you talking about how the sum of the whole is greater than each individual, especially at smaller levels.
Yes.
So, and a lot of times for people who don't really know NIL on such an intricate level, such as yourself, they don't, it's more of like a hypothetical, but I think this right here it's real, and you're bringing it to the small levels. And that's what people have had a really hard time doing, is bringing NIL down. So
Yes.
how did you identify that gap in the market? Because I'm really curious.
The first, like, so with the team, okay, so the first startup that I was ever at in 2003 was this company called Prime Point Media, right? And you guys are way too young to kind of remember what payphones are, but payphones were a thing. And there used to be millions and millions and millions of them all over the country, like several million. And they were doing exceptionally well right up until BlackBerry and iPhone. And then everybody just could get a BlackBerry and iPhone and nobody needed payphones anymore. And then they became very unsavory places that you wanted to hang around. But there was millions of them. And every like the sum of those individual payphones, like, the coin revenue that they were getting, it was okay. I mean, you'd made like 40, $50 at a good payphone, and you scale that over 1,000, 2,000 payphones, right? You're making really good money. But if you were able to build an advertising network and kind of group all of those small things together, which is exactly what this company Prime Point Media did, they got a deal with Verizon. And all of a sudden we had access to all Verizon's locations. So now all of a sudden we have access to these locations that are 2 million locations, let's call it. It was about that. And now we can put advertising in the form of like outdoor media on those places. And you can get into these neighborhoods that, guess what, like big big billboards can't get into, the 1448s or the 30 sheets, or even bus shelters, or even like, the phone kiosks that are on the city streets in Manhattan and now a bunch of other cities. You could get into these neighborhoods that you just couldn't get into. So I've kind of been doing this for 20 something years, right? Like working at the local level, understanding the aggregate, sort of the cumulative power of all these little individual things. Once you group them together and you get the scale that you need, all of a sudden you have something that, becomes attractive, not just to, like the car dealership down the road, but all of a sudden you got something that Procter and Gamble might want, or you've got something that Mondelez or Unilever or one of their brands, want to use, because you've got the right number of impressions. So, I really just took that kind of thinking, the payphone thinking, if you will, and applied it to student athletes. And it was the same sort of thing. It was like, okay, individually, these kids, while awesome, they're never going to do a deal by themselves because they don't know how. B, they don't have the time because they're playing like high level sports at like Princeton, Harvard, like Notre Dame, UNC, like I said. And they don't have enough followers. But if you group them all together, all of a sudden you've got this really powerful thing. So it didn't matter, to your point, Justin, it didn't matter that they were from smaller schools. It didn't matter that they had a little bit of like low followers. It was the aggregate and the numbers of impressions that they could deliver. And plus, again, the curation had a very big part in this, like, the GPA, the schools that we were working with, and sort of the digital standards, and like the representing themselves and their school with good character, like all that played into it. But really, it was the aggregated numbers of those kids that made this something unique. And that's kind of the same thinking that we apply now to the individual schools, right? So we went from, follow the journey here, payphone on the corner, to student athlete, to now Stony Brook, right? Which is stuck out in Stony Brook, Long Island, next to Port Jeff. Like that's their little world. That's their little fiefdom, right? They are only thinking about that. They're not thinking about, okay, well, what happens if we network together with Hofstra? What happens if all of a sudden, like, our audience is with Lehigh and Lafayette, and then down into Loyola, Maryland, or University of Maryland, and then out to maybe Wyoming, and down into UNC Wilmington, and then all of a sudden it's like BC and BU. Like when you aggregate all those things together, all of a sudden, again, back to that network effect, you have all these smaller things that in and of themselves are not attractive to brands at scale, but now all of a sudden scale, attractive, the number of eyeballs, and again, building on that bedrock of understanding that the brand dollars are typically not going to go anywhere. That's sort of the whole journey.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think there's two lessons here. I mean, oftentimes, like every year, there's fewer and fewer patents that are actually inventions on things, right? And so,
Yeah.
really, like innovation is not making anything new. It's really bringing together two concepts that nobody has done before.
Right.
And there's certainly this deep connection between your experience and the strategy with Prime Point. I love how you've really made an analogy to those two worlds and you're colliding them together. And the other one is that like if everybody is doing things this one way, it's almost like the lessons from these gold rush. Everybody's focused on the athlete databases and then
Yes.
serving the brands. Would you really think like a brand? You have that like media buyer experience and you think like that. But what is like the blue ocean strategy? There's a book about this where you're actually starting to serve the schools and the bleeding athletic departments out there where like there's so much money and attention and sharks eating in this red ocean, the biggest capital like center point, but like there's other people who need help and support. So where can you bring innovation and collide two ideas, and where can you go out into this blue ocean strategy? And I guess these things fueled your pivot. Is this kind of like how you've been pivoting, who you're presenting it to, and how you're
Oh yeah.
doing it? Yeah, maybe you can tell us about like how you did that and how it's been received. Specifically. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, and if I could add one more thing, sorry to interrupt you, Jake, but
Yeah.
just for the audience watching, for those of you who aren't really familiar with Division three or the smaller levels that aren't an FBS program, it's a big deal to be able to have just a little bit more cash in the athletic department. Like coming from Gettysburg College, having graduated relatively recently in 2021, it's a huge deal. Like in my senior year, we got just a new like sweatshirts, new gear, a new backpack. Like that was a big deal. And those
Yeah.
are things that Jake and Top Star Athletic Club are helping people do. So I think what you're doing is a huge deal. So sorry for interrupting, but just
No,
wanted.
no, no. You're totally right. I mean, look, dude, when I was at Gettysburg, and granted, it was like, 2, 3 years before you graduated, whatever. We don't talk about it.
To.
But like, I mean, we had nothing. I mean, zero. We were one of the top teams in the country. We operated like one of the top teams in the country. It was like we had Division I teams that, like, by the time I was a senior, didn't want to play us anymore. But we're operating on like a high school budget. It's like anything would have been awesome. I mean, like, I think we got free fall ball shorts and a t-shirt, maybe, but that was it, man. And like, it, to your point, like a couple $1,000, and I've had so many of these conversations with like coaches and ADs. They're like, man, if we just had a couple $1,000, we wouldn't have lost that kid. And so that's kind of like what we're hoping to do. Like, like my dream scenario is like we take like a school like, I don't know, BU or like, or like Lafayette or something, and we turn them into oh man, I just completely spaced. What the heck's it? Like a Gonzaga, right? Like, because like we turned like this sort of middle of the road in their conference basketball school or football school into like this super powerhouse because they joined Top Stars Network, and like all of a sudden they get a couple guys and like they change the entire face of that organization. Like that's like a dream. But I guess Justin, or I'm sorry, Jake, to your question on the pivot and kind of like how we change things. Topstar was unfortunately, as a standalone business, which I knew from the beginning. Like I knew that that business was never going to be, if we were able to get to about 10 million in revenue, it would have been incredible. So like we were hoping to maybe sell that business at some point, and 5 years for 150 or so million, like that would have been a huge win. Or even just getting it to a point where we were bringing in a few $1 million, and then we were like, working with with some other platforms. That would have been awesome. Unfortunately, like those types of businesses are because of, the TAM Sam Som thing, like our TAM wasn't like kind of unlimited, right? So like because of our, and that was a self-imposed limitation, right? Like we were trying to be, like we looked at sort of the other platforms as like, and sorry, other platforms, I do love you because you solved all of my legal problems. Thank you. But we kind of looked at them as like big box retailers, right? And we looked at ourselves as like, okay, like we're the white glove, we're the polo experience, right? Like you're getting these very high academic student athletes from elite universities, and they're like this, like they're the creme de la creme. Like these are the people who are going to be running, like the Fortune 500 businesses someday. But that's a limiting number of people even from a student athlete perspective, right? I think we eventually mathed out that there was like 25 or 30,000 kids in total. So not a huge universe. When you're talking about the entirety of the college ecosystem needing more money, every athletic department from the SEC literally to Gettysburg. And, I haven't talked to anybody in the SEC, but I have spoken to Gettysburg, and yes, they would love to have a couple $1,000 extra a month. When you're talking about that, you're talking about a massive market, huge. So the difference, just in scale alone, changed the conversations that we were having with investors immediately. So, when you go from addressing like what, and again, I love Popstar, still part of what we do, but it was like a cute company. It really was. It was a niche company. Like we were hyper focused in on this thing. And like I said, like if we had gotten to 10 million in revenue and we had sold the company, would have been a massive success. Now we're talking, in multiples of 10 of that. So we're really addressing a much larger market. We are solving a much bigger problem for a much broader group of people, and it just has a much higher upside. So that's really what changed everything when it came to the pivot, when it came to conversations with investors. I mean, in a month, like since we, really started talking about this, the amount of people who are interested in what we're doing has, been, I don't know, way more. I don't know what the number is, but way more than what it was when we were just doing the influencer marketing stuff.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And hats off to your success. It's cool talking to founders, because we met months ago, and I guess through Zoya. So shout out to Zoya from Orgo.
Oh yeah.
And the entrepreneurial and the startup journey is so nimble and agile if you're doing it right, that like you
Yeah.
position one thing different, you meet somebody different, you have some epiphany, and then all of a sudden some things can be happening differently. So
Yeah.
I guess with that being said, is everybody is still very excited about NIL. Here we are having some interesting NIL media moments throughout this fall. Like going into 2025, for anybody working in this ecosystem, besides what we've learned from you today, like what other pointers or guide
Yeah.
rails would you put down for people navigating this space?
Yeah, I'll tell you what I learned, right? Like it isn't, you figure out a problem to solve, right? Like, and don't be committed to the exact way that you want to solve that problem. Like for us, it's always been to make NIL work better for student athletes, better for brands, better for the future. We are like completely crazy about making sure that we stick to, does it do one of those three things at least? It realistically, like we try to make sure that it does, you know, 2 or 3 of those 3 things, but figure out what problem you want to solve, right? Like we want to make NIL work better. And by, you know, first working with student athletes and bringing it down to very, very, very granular, small levels with the individual student athletes, to now upsizing it and making NIL work better for athletic departments, like it's still the same mission, right? Like we're still trying to make NIL work better. And if you had said to me that I would have gone, because I mean, I've built 5 media company, you know, 5 media platforms at this point, from the out-of-home company that I mentioned in 2003, all the way up to Allstate, you know, for the last 5 years with the largest telematics database on like actual Earth. You know, like we have like, you know, we've done this. So like if my point is like, if you had told me that where we started would be where we are today, I've been like, what? I have no desire. Like, I don't want anything to do with building another media platform. Like, I don't want to do this. But by staying true to our value, our core value, and like the mission, like here we are. You know, it's like I would not have planned this. I did not plan this. I'm just listening to the market, following what the market is looking for, and trying to solve that problem. So, like, I guess find the problem that needs to be solved, and then stick to it. And like, if you have to pivot out of like what your original sort of idea is, don't be upset about that, but you know, like embrace it and kind of like fail fast, fix it faster, use the whole, you know, kind of mentality, like just lean into that mentality. As a founder, you have to, you know, otherwise you die. It's kind of adapt or die type stuff.
Absolutely. Jake, thank you so much for being on the show today. Where
Oh,
can people
appreciate it, fellas.
where can people keep in touch with you, follow your journey, you know, that sort of thing?
LinkedIn. We've got Topstar AC currently on Instagram, Topstar AC on LinkedIn. I'm Jake Kovalcik also on LinkedIn. And then, you know, that's probably about as many professional places as anybody needs.
That's the list. So thank you so much for giving us some NIL tips. Guys, thanks for joining another episode of the SBL podcast, where we bring innovators and disruptors and people making a difference here in sports. Justin, thanks for, you know, always being my co-host and everything. And Jake, thanks again for being on the show. Awesome
Appreciate
stuff.
it, fellas. Thank you
Thank
so
you very
much.
much, Jake.
I'm always afraid to click the wrong. Here we go.
Oh, don't do it.